Hey guys, so our light bulb went out today and we did not get a chance to go get a new one. So I'm going to do my video with the phone flashlight, which is kind of fun. I've never taught in the dark, so that'll be interesting. But our I can statement for writing today is I can combine clauses to create complex sentences. So right now that probably seems a bit confusing, like what's a clause? I only know of Santa Claus, right? But we're gonna go over it, it'll be really quick, and then you'll do a worksheet and you'll be done. All right, so let's get going. So first, let's just define what is a clause. A clause is basically just a group of words that has a subject, so something that the group of words is talking about, and a verb. So it could be any subject, any verb, and sometimes a clause can be a full sentence and sometimes it's not. So that's what we're going to get into next. Okay, so there are two types of clauses. The first is independent. An independent clause is basically just a sentence. It's a clause that can stand on its own. It doesn't need anything else to make it a sentence. It makes sense just as it is. So that's basically just a sentence, an independent clause. Okay, the second type of clause is dependent. A dependent clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, which you don't really need to get into what that means. It's just a word, and I have a list of words down here. So it begins with a subordinating conjunction, and it doesn't make sense on its own. It needs something to be put before it or after it to become a real sentence. So it's not a sentence on its own. And these dependent clauses start with words like after, although, because, even though, before, since, unless, until, when, and while. So if you see one of those words, you're probably going to think, oh, that's a dependent clause. It needs something else to go before it. It needs an independent clause to go with it, either before or after. So let's do a couple of practices and then we'll be done. All right, so now that we've learned about both of the clauses, I'm going to tell you that a complex sentence is just when you combine an independent and one or more dependent clauses. So that's a complex sentence. You're combining an independent clause with one or more dependent clauses. So let's do a couple practices. Okay, so here I have at least one dependent clause and one independent clause. That means one of these sentences is independent and one is dependent. Let's figure out what they are and then we can put them together into a complex sentence. So, the first one, because she scraped her knee. Now, when I read that, is that a full thought? Is that a complete thought? Do I know everything that's happening and am I good to go? Is this a complete sentence? No, it's not. Because she scraped her knee, what happened because she scraped her knee? Why did she scrape her knee? Like, you have so many questions. It's not a complete thought. So that means that this clause, must be the dependent clause because it's not a complete thought. It needs something to go with it, right? So I'm going to put a D next to that for dependent clause. My sister cried. Okay, is that a complete sentence? Yes, you told me who and you told me a verb. My sister cried. So we're good to go. That's a complete thought. I don't need anything else for it to make sense, right? So this is an independent clause. Now let's put them together. This is when it gets a little tricky. There are two ways to put these clauses together. I could put the dependent clause first, or I could put the independent clause first. Either way we do it, we have to do something different. So, if I put the dependent clause second, that means I'm putting this first. So I would write, oops, there we go. My sister cried because she scraped her knee. I hope you guys can see this and that you can hear me. Sometimes I don't know if I'm yelling or if I'm not talking loud enough. All right, my sister cried because she scraped her knee. Sorry, my computer went off. I hope that's still recorded. Anyway, we have our independent clause and our dependent clause in here. So this right here, my sister cried, is our independent clause. And then Everything after is our dependent clause. And now we have a complete sentence. We have a complex sentence. This is the example where you put the independent clause first. Let me show you what happens when you put the independent clause second. Okay, so if I'm putting the independent clause second, that means I have to start with a dependent clause. So let me start with that. Because she scraped her knee, and when we put the dependent clause first and the independent clause second, we have to do a comma after the dependent clause. It's just a rule. So this is my dependent clause. It came first, so I have to do a comma right after it before I put the independent clause. Now I can say, because she scraped her knee, my sister cried. And that is how you do it when the independent clause is second. You have to remember that comma if that independent clause is going second. Let's do one more really short one and then we'll be done. Okay, so here are two clauses. Let's first figure out which one is independent, which one is dependent. He was still unhappy. Is that a complete thought? Is that a full sentence? Are we good to go? He was still unhappy. Yeah, so I think that must be our independent clause because it can stand on its own. It's independent. It doesn't need anything else. So that one is our independent clause. Although he had money. Well, first of all, I see although. That's one of my clues. That is a subordinating conjunction, which we know start dependent clauses. So because I see that subordinating conjunction, this must be a dependent clause. So I'm going to put a D. This is the dependent clause. And although he had money, we can tell it's also a dependent clause because that's not a complete thought, right? I need something before it. I need something after it for it to make complete sense. So let's do the two ways we can put these together, and then we'll be done. First, let's put the independent clause first, okay? So we could write this. He was still unhappy, comma, although he had money. That would be how you write that. So I'm going to pause it, and then I'm going to write it, and I'll explain. Okay, so I quickly just writ the two options of a sentence that we could make combining these two clauses. The first complex sentence we could make is, he was still unhappy, although he had money. The second is, although he had money, he was still unhappy. This first option starts with our independent clause. It starts with, he was still unhappy. That's a complete thought. That's our independent clause. We don't need a comma after it. We can just add on that dependent clause to it, and then it's a complex sentence. The second option starts with our dependent clause. It starts with, although he had money. Because that's not a complete thought, we need to add a comma after it. So, although he had money, comma, he was still unhappy. Basically, all you need to remember for complex sentences is, it's when you're combining a independent clause and a dependent clause together. If the independent clause starts the sentence, you don't need a comma. If the dependent clause starts the sentence, you do need a comma right after that dependent clause. And then you have a complex sentence. So, on the worksheet, make sure you look at the sentences that they provide you. It's going to want you to combine the two sentences. If the first sentence that they wrote is the dependent clause and the second sentence is the independent clause, you're going to want to make sure you add that comma because we remember dependent clauses need a comma after. If they give you the independent clause sentence first and the dependent clause second, then you don't need a comma, you just combine them together. Okay? Super easy. I hope that helps. If this was way too confusing, there's also a little written explanation on your paper, so maybe that will help. This is some heavy stuff, guys, so just do your best, okay? If you have questions, just email me. You are somebody. You were somebody when you came, and you'll be a better somebody when you leave. You're learning every day. I love you guys. Good luck.